So first off, thank you all very much for joining us for this webinar on the cookieless future. Uh, I talk a lot about what's going to happen when Chrome deprecates third-party cookies. I do it so much, in fact, that I have my own outfit for it. So this is my Cookie Monster, and we are ready to begin. So I think it's always important to know your Shakespeare. So alas, poor cookies, I knew you well. Welcome. Also, in 4 minutes, for those of you who celebrate, it will be the official start of spring. Today, I'm going to talk to you all for about 15 minutes about what's going on with cookies, what's likely to happen, and then we're going to have this esteemed panel where there'll be a Q&A moderated by my colleague, Becky Harris, who's Vice President, Measurement and Data Solutions. But first, you're stuck with me. So let us begin. So we'll start with what are cookies and why are they going away? So most of you probably know this. I'll go through it really quick, but cookies are little bits of text that are dropped on your computer, usually by websites, but not exclusively. And the key thing to know throughout this session is that a first-party cookie, which are vital to the functions of many websites, is a cookie dropped by the domain you're on. So if you're on CNN.com, CNN drops a cookie, that's a first-party cookie. Third-party cookies are dropped by web elements other than the page being visited, which means that if you have a measurement cookie on the website that belongs to a measurement company, that is a third-party cookie drop because the cookie's domain does not match the domain on the website that you're actually visiting. So what's happening? So Google's stated purpose is that they want to get rid of digital fingerprinting, enhance privacy on the web for all of their Chrome users. And so as a result, Chrome will be preventing third-party cookies from being dropped on their browser, Chrome, which is important because it is the last major browser that allows third-party cookies by default. That represents about 60% of all browser use. It's a little different in the US versus the world, but generally speaking, you are talking about by far the most used browser. And so eliminating this digital fingerprinting prevents people, third parties, from being able to track what consumers do across the internet. Really important thing to keep in mind here, we talk about a cookieless future, everybody talks about cookies going away, but Chrome's deprecation of third-party cookies does not create a cookieless world. As I mentioned earlier, cookies are essential for the functioning of a lot of websites, particularly retail. If you want to know why when you're not logged into a retail shop, it still knows that you've got something in your basket, this is why. Lots of really important, valuable things that first-party cookies do. So we're not going into a cookieless world. We are getting rid of, Chrome is getting rid of, by default, the ability of a third party to drop a cookie. You can also turn that back on, but that's another story. So what happened? This story really starts earlier than 2018, but I think for our purposes, 2018 is a good place to start. That's when Apple's IDFA policy, privacy policy update, really started to shake things up. A little later in the year, Firefox introduced enhanced tracking protection. And then by the following year, both Apple and Firefox had blocked third-party cookies by default. 2 years later, Google announced that it would also phase out third-party cookies, again, due to privacy concerns, as we've discussed, and announced that that would happen in 2023. For those of you who have calendars, you know that that's not happened. 2022, but since then they've been working on this thing called the Privacy Sandbox I'll talk about in a bit, but different ways that people can engage and do targeting in ways that don't require cookies. They started with something called the federated learning of cohorts. That got phased out. And then they've shifted this a couple of different ways, but then they pushed it out to 2024. That was back in 2022 when they pushed the deadline. And the expectation or the line is that we're going to see third-party cookies deprecated by July 2024. As of January this year, they have done 1% for testing. But for reasons that I'll describe later, I don't think that anyone should be particularly optimistic that the July 2024 deadline is going to be met. So I talked about the Privacy Sandbox. What is that? That is an initiative that Google has put out to help replace many of the things people have been doing in the industry with cookies. And I won't go through all of them. They're doing a lot of really interesting work. But just a few of them I mentioned on the screen here. Topics API is probably the one you're going to hear the most about. And so this is providing advertisers the means to target based on shared interest-based categories. And those are based on recent browsing history on the user's device. That sounds like Flock. It's not entirely unlike what that process was, but that's how they are anticipating a large amount of ad buying and selling to happen. Fenced frames is an embedded frame type that's not permitted to communicate with the host page so that the identifiers can't be joined. Attribution reporting APIs meant, you might be shocked to learn, to facilitate conversion tracking. And then protected audience is a way to help targeting to interested audiences, including through retargeting. This was formerly known as Fledge. So how's it working? The reaction in the industry has not been overwhelmingly welcoming. IAB recently put out a rather large report saying that they believe that the Chrome Privacy Sandbox is going to break the way real-time bidding works. I will say there are a few people out there saying that that's a good thing, but it is dangerous if that's true. Other folks in the industry, the Trade Desk in particular, other folks who have other identifiers that they want to use in place of cookies obviously have a rationale to not like this in general, but a lot of this conversation is around, is this anti-competitive? The press has, generally speaking, not been overly welcoming of this. I wouldn't say that it's 100% negative. It isn't. But a lot of it is like this, where this notion of privacy focus is replacing one form of surveillance for another. I'm not sure that's 100% accurate, but this is what's going on in the trades. And then I think the most important thing is the UK, forget what the CMA stands for, but it's their anti-competitive organization. They've ordered Google to halt the cookie phase out until the agency's concerns are met. That was, I think that happened last year. They've been having quarterly updates with Google. It does seem like progress is made. But at this point, the rule from the CMA is that Google cannot proceed with third-party cookie deprecation until their concerns are resolved. And they describe where we are as a standstill period. That standstill period doesn't mean that progress isn't being made. It just means it's being made behind the scenes. And the next report, I believe, is April. We'll learn a lot more then. So what is it that the UK Competition and Markets Authority is worried about? The first is market dominance. They're worried that Google's dominance in online advertising will be further strengthened if they control the only available alternative solutions. Unfair advantage. This is a concern that Google might design the privacy sandbox in a way that favors its own advertising products like Google Ad Manager, which would give them an unfair advantage. I want to reiterate, these are their concerns. This is not a question of what is or isn't happening. Transparency and governance. They're looking for more clarity on how the long-term governance and development of the sandbox will be handled and how potential biases will be mitigated. And then finally, there's concern that smaller companies will not be able to compete in this environment. and they want to know how the Privacy Sandbox can be integrated with smaller ad tech companies to avoid stifling competition and innovation in the space. So stepping forward, how do we measure advertising return on investment without cookies? Most of what you saw that Google's working on in the sandbox is very much around how you target ads, other than the conversion API. So there are four main ways that the industry is responding to this. The first three are all things that Dynata is currently doing and has deployed. So we're taking a multi-pronged approach. The reason we're doing this is it both expands feasibility and it ensures future-proofing. The fourth is not a Dynata solution, but it is something that we help people do. So let's go through it. IP addresses to identify household level exposure. So rather than using a cookie to tell you whether or not a browser associated with a person is exposed, this will tell you across all devices in a household whether or not one or more of them have been exposed. So the pro, this is easy. The approach is already widely used in the US, especially with respect to television, which is always measured at the household level. The cons for this is that it does muddle the relationship of the exposure to the individual. We call this the personification problem. So the fact that a device in the household was exposed doesn't mean that the person who's answering your survey was the person whose device it was. The other piece is that the quality of your identity graph is extremely important, right? You don't want an IP from a coffee shop to land with one of your panelists to be associated, and then suddenly you've got tens of thousands of devices. Dynata, we have a very good device graph and a lot of ways to prevent that, but that's really important. Partnerships with publishers. So great thing about partnerships with publishers is that you have a direct relationship with the folks who are first party to those exposures, and you can do a match with your panelists and you get one-to-one measurement at the end of the individual to ad exposures, which is great. The downside to partnerships is that they fail really rapidly when you start doing cross-publisher measurement, if you're doing just this. So if you think about how this works, if I do a match between my panel and let's say three large publishers, what is the probability that I have matched that individual on all three platforms? What's the probability that they use the same email address on all three platforms? Very quickly, you get to a point where it becomes impossible to have a set of people under measurement who are under measurement for all of the publishers. So it's a great publisher solution. It's great for small groups, but it turns out to work very poorly if that's all you're doing across exposures. We have a bunch of partnerships. We have one with Comcast, which we announced recently. We're certified with Google for YouTube via Ads Data Hub, Amazon's server-to-server, and a bunch more. And in fact, today, Dynata measures more digital advertising in a cookieless manner by far than anyone else, including Facebook, Instagram, and others. Browser extensions. So a browser extension is a little bit of software that you download, connects to your browser, and it does things for you that theoretically you would like. We have a browser extension that can be downloaded by our panelists. They log into it with their Dynata credentials. There's permissioning in there. It explains exactly what we're doing. We call this a thin browser because all it looks for is a Dynata tag. If you load a page that doesn't have a Dynata tag, the extension doesn't do anything and it doesn't send any information back for us. The pro, it provides essentially identical data as cookies. The con is that the requirement for downloading a plugin does reduce the size of your available panel. One other thing I should mention is that there are people in the industry who are doing full meters with their extension, meaning they are capturing everything you do on internet. So conversion, search, email, everything. We have the ability to do that. We have elected not to do it for a variety of reasons. But number one, it's a challenging thing from a privacy perspective, even with permission. Second, because Google's stated purpose is to prevent exactly this kind of thing, which is don't allow third parties to see everything that you do. There's a concern that at some point Google might simply turn off the ability of such extensions to function. So very limited in order to be able to just get ad exposures. Last on this list is marketing mix modeling, and this is very much an example of everything old is new again. We've been doing market mix models for decades. The Pro market mix model is a tracking survey that you add your ad mix to, and then you can tell using time series analysis how the different contributors to your media, such as your TV spend, digital spend, et cetera, are impacting the KPIs you care about. The Pro combines all of your media contributions in the same study, all of your KPIs, and doesn't require any identifiers. The Con, it's really slow, so it can't be used for in-flight optimization, and it's very expensive. A lot of folks doing a really good job with this stuff, and a lot of them by Dynata Sample, which we're very happy about, which is why we don't have this as a solution ourselves. So last, number of unknowns with respect to measurement. Measurement really hasn't been the focus of the sandbox in the same way as it has been to targeting. And Google has yet to clarify several really important questions related to how measurement will work after third-party deprecation. The first is, we don't know how to know which of the 1% of Chrome browsers have had third-party cookies turned off in the test. If we knew how to tell the difference, for example, if the user agent had a .1 on it that we knew was meant this, then we could look at our panelists, find the ones who've had this turned off, and know exactly what's going to happen with these solutions, but we don't. I'll actually do the third one for a second. Will Google allow access to targeting cohorts for measurement purposes? So for example, we can target in the future based on these topics, but can I know which topics are associated with each of my first-party panelists? It's an open question. And then the last one, and I think really important, is will first-party cookies be able to be read on third-party sites? So this is a really big question for us. And I should mention that a cookie list, the deprecation of third-party cookies is actually, when you think about winners and losers, is a real boon for first-party data, such as Dynata's first-party panel, because we can get permissions. We drop a first-party cookie for measurement, which means that you get the Dynata cookie when you're on a Dynata domain. When an ad fires with our cookie on it, with our tag on it, we don't drop a cookie. We don't write to the cookie that's on the machine. All we do is we look for the existence of that cookie. That's what the tag does. And then it lets us know if there's exposure. And at this moment in time, it is not at all clear that that's going to stop working. It may very well be the case that our existing first-party cookie solution will simply continue to operate. Again, we're not sure. We're building everything else, and all of those other things expand feasibility and quality. So we're going to keep doing those regardless. With that, I'd like to introduce Becky Harris, Vice President, Measurement Data Solutions at Dynata, who will take us through the video. Thank you all very much.
Great, thank you, Stephen. So I've seen a couple of questions come in. I'd love to encourage you guys to put any questions in the Q&A box. We're going to leave a few minutes at the end of this panel to run through them. I'm going to kick off by introducing the panel that we've got here. So let's start with Carl Meller. He is Professor of Marketing at Duke. He has had previous industry positions. And Carl's focus is on advertising, branding, and MarTech. He's published extensively in scientific journals, and he's also in the Harvard Business Review. Nishat Mehta is currently the chair of the Advertising Research Foundation, as well as COO and president of Lexitas, I think I've pronounced that correctly, Nishat, a legal services company. He was previously the president of Global Products and Solutions at Circana, where amongst other things, he led the media business. Then Hu Wang, our SVP here at Global Intelligence of Publishers Media. In this role, she's been able to collaborate across publicists, analytics, and research teams across the world to scale innovation and best practices. So as you see, we've got a very esteemed panel here who know this industry very well, which is great. So thank you guys very much for joining us today. So I'm going to kick this off. We'll probably go back to a little bit of basics in the sense like I've always felt like advertising, planning, media buying, measurement, there's a whole range of aspects in our industry that involves tons of amazing technology, new buzzwords every single day, probably every hour. And where I've seen a definite evolution over the last few years, it's either evolution driven by the cookieless world, or generally it's more around like interoperability, it's ID graphs, it's partners, it's clean rooms. With so many fragmentation, like with so many innovations, the fragmentation in media buying and all of that complexity, I want to kick off with actually quite surprisingly, quite simply, how have you looked to navigate this change to help your clients achieve their goals? So Hu, I want to sort of start with you, speaking from an agency point of view, how is that deprecation by Chrome going to impact how you're approaching this?
Yeah, I'm happy to share how Publicis is helping our clients. We actually efforts can be bucketed out with three aspects. There's a lot of client education going on. Actually, long before Chrome start to talk about the privacy sandbox, like we know things are changing. We want to get clients prepared. So after education, we also start to help the client to assess their readiness. So we provide a very extensive survey questionnaire, work with individual clients to assess what are the risk, how much of their targeting and measurement depend on third-party cookies, so they can help to prioritize their efforts. What efforts? We'll talk about the testing efforts. So in fact, since 2022, we have started to work with probably more than 50 tech partners to figure out what's the testing opportunities locally. And not just in US, global
not
as
complex
well.
Then. Not complex at all, right?
Exactly. So and also Epsilon, we also have the Epsilon testing on the privacy sandbox that they share the feedback to Chrome and also as well as to our agencies to get the learnings for preparedness. One thing I want to say is that everybody has a different maturity level. Right. So this is not something we will always have to collaborate and figure out the next step.
I might, I might just add, I think as much as to your point, it can be overwhelming at times to see how much is changing. I think it's also valuable at times like this to think about what stays the same. And I think what stays the same is we do have a guide on what the consumer wants in whatever the final privacy regulation looks like. We know that a consumer needs to have the right to choose whether or not their data is being used, and they need to have the ability to control whether that data is used and whether they can turn it off. And I think if you keep those as the North Star, certainly the perspective I probably bring to the table is more on the data provider side. It becomes very important to make sure that the data you're collecting meets those two criteria. And so, we spent a lot of time focused on things like loyalty card data, because we believe very strongly that loyalty card data is a very clear connection with the user. The user gets a discount in exchange for the sharing of their data. The consumer makes a decision with each and every purchase at the grocery store whether to present their loyalty card or not. So if they're choosing to buy something that they consider sensitive or something that they don't want known, then simply don't present the loyalty card for that one transaction. Your data is not collected. You may not get the discount associated with that item. But those feel like they meet with the long-term goal of how we want privacy to ultimately work. And as a result, we think regardless of whatever changes, regardless of what happens to third-party cookies, regardless of what Google decides they're going to replace it with, and then regardless of what they decide they're going to replace that with in a few years, because let's face it, this is not the last time we see a new technology, we'll know that the core of the data collection that we have survives because it's what consumers actually want and theoretically what they would vote for.
Yeah, I love the fact that you're bringing the consumer into this as well. I mean, it's pretty fundamentally important of why this is happening anyway. Carl, I definitely want to understand a bit more in your area, thinking about it from, the academics and marketing space, where you're looking at tech, marketing, consumers. Are there areas of innovation that you think are going to evolve further and become more prominent?
Thanks for the question, Becky. I want to wish everyone a happy first day of spring. Certainly, I also teach digital marketing here, and there are some major changes. I think most of us are aware of them, though. We're sitting on the front lines. We know retail media or commerce media is becoming very attractive because first-party data are becoming more attractive. It's hard to do behavioral targeting as third-party cookies disappear. So first-party data that enables us to do that, and retail media fits that. And that would include even buy buttons, on social media, for example, as a channel for selling items directly, and being able to measure lift, which is a wonderful thing. But there are some downsides. Retail media, we're seeing CPMs rise dramatically, so they're not as good an investment as they used to be. We also have to recognize it's kind of a different beast. A lot of these retail media impressions are sold as position auctions. And so usually we just think about ads affecting awareness. But as I move up and down in the search results on a retail media site, based on how I advertise, I'm having a direct impact on distribution as well. So advertising is getting entwined with distribution. And perhaps most important from a branding perspective, top of funnel is getting ignored altogether because I'm placing my ads at the point of purchase. So how do I broaden awareness? Steve mentioned some other trends in this space, like publisher partnerships, including walled gardens, universal IDs, browser extensions, contextual targeting. I think that just all aligns, most of it anyway, with a more general shift to mass media and contextual advertising, which suggests, we're kind of going back to the future here with reach becoming more important relative to targeting. And, that may or may not be bad. Again, if you think about it from a branding perspective, it's less efficient in terms of measuring lift, but it's always important to generate brand awareness from a brand equity perspective. So summing up, retail media seems ascendant. First-party data is on the rise, and these are some of the key ways advertisers are adapting to the deprecation of cookies.
So this is my complete biases here. I definitely see a huge focus on first-party data. The ability to verify the identity of an individual coming through, visiting your website, using all of these different authenticated traffic solutions that are out there. I'm a huge believer in having that first-party data strategy. There's definitely a more pressing urgency that a brand has a very strong first-party data strategy as well to truly optimize the opportunities there. What I'm wondering a bit, leaning in, Carl, on what you talk about contextual targeting, how have each of you been thinking about how the creation of target audiences, personalization, and that consideration of contextual targeting without cookies in place is coming through? Carl, are you speaking?
The last piece about contextual targeting. I heard the first part of the question. The second one just faded on me. Sorry.
Yeah, so I was wondering how each of you are thinking about the creation of targeting audiences, personalization, all of that without the use of a cookie.
Yeah.
Actually,
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry. We've got a little lag here, folks, so we may talk over each other a bit. I think that the thing I'd like to sort of prompt with this is there's a lot of concern that targeting is going to get worse as a result of this. And there's no real basis for knowing at this point whether that's true or not. So people think that I've got my list of cookies, I know who's who, I've got vendors telling me that if I send this to those folks, these are going to be the kind of audience that I see. These are going to be early tech adopters. These are going to be women 18 to 55. Fact of the matter is, generally speaking, programmatic in target percentage for advertising is around 40%. So about 60% of ads in general aren't hitting their target today. So it's hard to know as a prior that this is going to be less effective for targeting. It will definitely change how we target. If you think about how most people target, most people are targeting on demographics, and that's not going to be something that's allowable with this process. So it'll be different. There's going to be a lot of things to get used to, but I just want to caution everyone that it doesn't mean worse. We don't know that yet.
Yeah, I would like second to Stephen. That's why our approach has that's testing. Why we do know there are a lot of alternative solutions out there. So in the context of first party, we have been testing out. First of all, it provided foundations for you to get insight for contextual targeting, right? That will be the foundation for you to apply the topics. But we have seen a lot of advertisers can also apply it, use the first-party data along with clean room, right, to get the scale. Because first-party itself is not enough to scale. Also, there's another challenges we are trying to solve for in the context that if clients don't actually have a robust first-party data, right, they are not going to build their first-party overnight. So what is immediate actions that they can take and consider? And again, this goes back to, this is not just how we use first-party data, but also we need to have a different mindset on how we collect those first-party data, right? Nowadays, we oftentimes very transactional mindset, right? You're about to buy, let me get you. So how can we have a more creative way, right? More fun, more about experience, more about relationship building, so you can collect those first-party data along the way of the customer journey.
Do you know what I love about that? Again, it goes back to Nishat's point around the consumer experience. So I'd love to understand a bit more, like, how do you think this is actually going to affect the consumer and their experience with brands? And Nishat, maybe you can contribute there.
Yeah, so I think one of the things we struggled with, and again, the space that I was in previously, we serve the consumer packaged goods industry, and CPG is a complex. Well, every industry has its complexities, but in particular related to this question, CPG doesn't sell direct to consumer. And so we debated often about the importance of first-party versus third-party data. To a CPG, purchase information is actually third-party data. And so none of us would complain about Hilton hotels using their own first-party conversion data to better target their advertising. And yet, simply because of a mechanism of the industry, P&G using their sales data needs to go through a third party. And so we debated that quite a bit and ultimately decided that the issue isn't first versus third party data, it's purchase data, and the mechanisms by which purchase data are collected, let's find a way to make that actually work. So I think in relation to this question, where I would really focus on is data can be collected in very easy, simple ways, oftentimes using the third-party cookie, and that invites bad actors. It invites people to take the easy way out and collect data that isn't necessarily the best data to predict behavior of the consumer. I think real-world behavior about where we spend our money and where we spend our time are, in fact, the two things that determine whether or not what a consumer wants. And I think it's going to come down to finding ways to collect data in those two areas that, again, are sort of ethically sourced and really focus on what the consumer is actually spending their money and their time on.
I think the other thing that we also need, I always think about the two flows, like data in, which is the impact and the consumption of the data from a consumer, but then also the data out in terms of like how we're measuring the impact of that campaign as well on the consumer's experience. Do you think that that's going to shift and change? Like, I know I don't want to be targeted for advertising based upon my age and my gender. Not interested. I would much rather they target me based on something I'm interested in. How do you think that's going to affect things?
I think a lot of this is going to be, it's not going to be transparent to the consumer. I think a lot of the tools that are being built to replace this, from the consumer's perspective, are going to look very much the same. I think we are going to continue to see retargeting, and there'll be some confusion. Me personally, I actually kind of like the ability of advertisers to tell me to show me ads that I care about. I would much rather see ads for whiskey than women's clothes. You can argue whether or not that second one is something maybe I should be more interested in, but we'll keep my personal life out of this. But yeah, I don't think consumers are going to see this as much different. I think the parts of this that are protecting their privacy aren't going to be transparent to them.
Yeah, I
think that's
agree. Yeah, I
Go
think,
ahead, Carl.
Yeah, I agree with Stephen. I think from the consumer's perspective, a lot of this will look transparent, especially the better a job Google does in recreating our ability to reach on interested audiences. The flip side of that coin, of course, is when we use protected audiences APIs and things like that, retargeting looks like retargeting to consumers. And if they were annoyed with the old solution, they're going to be annoyed with the new one too. So I think we have to be careful how we tread. But there's actually a fair amount of, it turns out because of the GDPR and CCPA, there's actually an incredible amount of analysis now on how consumers are affected. One recent study suggests that the number of consumer searches is up by over 5%. They're spending.
Did we lose Carl?
We lost
We
Carl.
may have, but I know the study he was referring to, and maybe while he rejoins, I think the comment he was going to make is that we're finding that, in fact, in the sort of attempt to try to achieve a better privacy, whatever kind of the word better means, we may have actually made the consumer experience worse. Right. In this case, we've shown that it's actually taking 5% more searches for the consumer to actually find what they're looking for, because historical behavior about the consumer, other things you might have previously been able to learn about the consumer prior to GDPR can no longer actually be used in the results of a search query. And so if a consumer actually knew that, are we certain that they would be comfortable with sort of a one-way path towards more and more and more and more privacy? Or in fact, are we beginning to realize that we may have actually overshot what is the sweet spot and we now maybe need to pull back a little bit?
That's actually I've not heard that come up before, so that's a really interesting comment. I know we've got quite a few questions from the audience as well, so I do want to just take a pause and ask each of you, like, what would you say are the top 2 positives that you would take out of this scenario, the innovation this is pushing, and the challenges for the audience, and then we can shift on to a quick Q&A.
I'm happy to kick it off. I'll pick just one and let my colleagues here focus on others. I think the unspoken component, or the part that not everybody fully appreciates, is the lack of a third-party cookie has, frankly, we've been facing it for the last 6 years. In 2018, as Steve walked us through the history of this, we've been dealing with the Apple ecosystem not using third-party cookies for quite some time. And so whenever you're getting measurement from your measurement provider, it's almost significantly or all Chrome and maybe some Internet Explorer Edge users. We've completely removed the Apple ecosystem and all the shoppers that use the Apple ecosystem from measurement reports. And so we have a bias sample. We know that there is bias associated with people that use an iOS ecosystem versus an Android or a Windows ecosystem. And so for me, this shifts the bias. It doesn't remove it, but it shifts bias towards folks that are potentially willing to authenticate themselves. And not everyone will, but most people do. And so I think a strong belief here, and the optimism is around, we actually get to a less biased outcome than we have previously, and in fact, probably a more transparent one, because now we actually understand what those biases are versus previously.
Hugh?
Oh, yeah. I think I can share maybe 2, I think we're talking about a paradigm shift, right? And in this process that we actually find out a lot of the things, the foundational importance to advertising got resurfaced, and the clients start to pay more attention. For example, we have been talking about the MMM, right? Using MMM to do strategic guidance decisions. Right? This is really a time of, we call it MMM renaissance. The clients start not just using MMM, but use it to answer more strategic questions, also get more granular insight. So lots of evolutions on the methodology happening. Also, we have been advise the clients on, you have the major long-term effects, branding effects, have a better investment strategy between brand and performance, look at it more fluidly. And this happens to surface up this conversation, re-engage the client to, deploy different approaches to thinking about this. So, yeah, so this is, I think, great things for us to go back to the foundations there.
Over to Carl.
Yeah, sorry, I dropped out. I just assumed Becky hit a kill button, but back.
Stop talking.
I start talking about data. Oh God, another academic going off on data again. So just finishing that point briefly, just one sentence. The consumer experience under privacy is worse. Like that's what the academic research shows. And I don't think we should, as an industry, be altogether too defensive about the value we bring them by creating better match from the products we serve in terms of our ads. Okay, so in terms of positives here, I think, I view this measurement shift away from, say, attribution to MMM, the way that Hui was talking about, is actually could be a very positive thing. I'm reminded back in the 1980s when supermarket scanner data was done with warehouse withdrawals, and you could only update every 2 weeks. And with scanner data, you could do this every day. So what happened is consumer goods companies showed that promotion or discount lift was tremendous, and they could measure it. So they shifted all their budgets to discounts. And when we entered a world analogously with advertising where we could do very tight targeting, we became very lift oriented and focused on the transaction. But if you look at where margins come from, if you look where brand strength comes, it's from classic branding campaigns. This is what we measure with MMM. So to me, a silver lining in all of this is, it may help force us back to focus on what's really important, that's creating great brands through our advertising.
Great, I love that. Right, we've got just enough time for a few questions. We will follow up with answers to the Q&A that I've put in the box after this session as well. So we will get some of the answers out to you. One of the questions that has come in is, what's the panel's opinion on where consumers spend their time online? Third-party cookies impact the browser-based impressions, but time is shifting, right? I know I spend a lot of time in social and app usage. So what are your thoughts there?
So first off, thank you, Becky, for hitting the kill switch on Carl again. What I would say is the larger, so there are a lot of parts of the internet that couldn't have been measured with cookies previously, and the deprecation of third-party cookies doesn't change that. So we have to have other strategies. Those come in the form of partnerships like we have with Google, for YouTube, like we have with some of the large publishers, and also sort of more clever approaches in some cases, such as we have an approach that does a random control trial on Facebook and Instagram that allows us to do true third-party independent measurement there. So it's, I would say this doesn't change anything all that much. We've still needed to measure things cookieless that don't have cookies. We'll still have to do that. I do kind of like the idea that this all forces us to try and be more clever, because in some ways, I think measurement had been stagnating a bit.
I think that's
I would completely second that. And again, I think there's a lot of thought about collecting this information directly from the consumer. And I think that's where we start to get to a place that it generally feels more consumer friendly. So a panel that allows, that convinces me to install an app on my phone or a plugin in my browser that is able then to track other things about me is done so with my permission. And as a result, you're collecting the information that you want from me. I'm getting something out of it, or else I wouldn't have installed these things. And so to your point, Stephen, we're being more clever about the collection of data, and we're being forced to do it in a way that feels far more transparent to the panelist, the consumer, the individuals on which this data is actually being collected.
I know we're wrapping up.
Is that the importance of understanding how panels construct in a unbiased way, right? That kind of the questions that will actually become more prominent, and more advertisers going to challenge is how do you collect a panel, right? How represented it is. So I think this is definitely will be something you will hear us agency and the clients ask more in the future.
And one of the questions, I won't cover it, but we will do a follow-up and answer, as I mentioned, but was around like quality, how do we ensure quality IP addresses? There's so many components to what you've called out, Nisha, in terms of that value exchange and the verified individual that is sat behind answering the questions to your market research. I think we can never get away, and we can't forget that there's actually consumer behind everything that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. I'm going to sort of wrap up and close with a closing statement in a second, but I want to thank the panel here. And like I said, we'll do a follow-up on the Q&A that's in the chat as well for the team here. But I always feel like there's always a tiny component anytime I get into a conversation that demystifies the cookieless world. In a tiny, tiny little fraction, there's so many complexities. There's a lot of different like level up of everything that we're doing. And I think there is a lot of opportunity to be smarter, and there's a lot of opportunity to be more innovative in terms of how we work together in our own world, but also with how we engage with consumers as well. So I certainly appreciate the fact that I won't necessarily be targeted with terrible advertising. That's a positive for me, and I'm all the more interested in providing a value exchange to ensure it's more impactful for me as a consumer. I welcome, I really thank you guys for the thoughts that you've shared with us today. Thank you everyone here for listening in and joining this webinar with these industry experts. If you want to find out more, don't be afraid to reach out to us or visit dynata.com, and we'll do a follow-up with some of the Q&A. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.